Dear Rector, dear guests, colleagues, students, I'm very honored and pleased to have you all here to the Kapuscinski Development Lectures to be provided by Professor Daron Acemoğlu. This is Fikret Adaman. I'm from the Economics Department of Boğaziçi University. Now, first of all, let me have İpek Cem Taha as the Director of the Columbia Global Center to deliver her speech. Sorry.
Don't worry, it's not a speech. Değerli misafirlerimiz, Columbia Üniversitesi ve
Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Columbia University and the Columbia Global Centers, I'd like to welcome you to this conference. This has been a collaborative project. We have the UNDP, the European Commission, Columbia University, and Boğaziçi University all collaborated in organizing this meeting. And we will now have the opportunity to listen to Mr. Daron Acemoğlu, who is professor at MIT. As Columbia, we really wanted to host him on our campus in the US. We haven't succeeded so far. It's easier to go from Boston to New York, but we feel that it's extra pleasant to have him here in Istanbul. As a poet said, the magic of returning to Istanbul is unique. Daron Acemoğlu is one of the most renowned economists and most quoted economists of our age. I have known him since my childhood. He is the son of Uncle Kevork and Aunt Irma. I was fortunate to get to know him as a child. Professor Kevork Acemoğlu, his late father, was a distinguished jurist, lawyer, and he was a close friend of my father. So the two families would meet often, and we would always have a lot of laughter and happiness in the house when they visited. This is a new meeting here at Boğaziçi, but this new meeting will also help carry the history of way back when to the future. We're going to see his perspective about the economy, history, and how history impacts the economy. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all of you for joining us today, and I'd like to wish all of you a very good evening.
Well, thank you, İpek. The reason I'm nervous is how to pronounce the next person's surname, Mr. Ivan Verzhonovsky, who is the head of partnerships, UNDP, Istanbul region up. Ivan, please.
Thank you. Excellent pronunciation, so you did well. You shouldn't have been nervous. Professor Acemoğlu, distinguished guests, colleagues, students of this distinguished university, on behalf of the European Commission and the United Nations Development Programme, I would like to welcome you to the latest in a series of Kapuscinski Development Lectures. I would really like to extend our thanks to Boğaziçi University and Columbia Global Center in Istanbul for hosting us here today. These premises are really impressive, and you really don't feel that you're in the same city as where our offices are. It's also a great partnership that we've been having for a number of years, and I'm happy it's continuing. So the lecture we're attending today is just the latest in an important legacy of the Kapuscinski Development Lectures. And the reason that we're doing this is, together with our partners, the European Commission and distinguished universities, we want to connect the world's top thinkers in development with students from around the globe. Over 110 lectures over the past 10 years were attended by 130,000 participants. And they're a testimony to a successful partnership between UNDP, the European Commissions, and the world's most prestigious universities. These lectures offer a window to new knowledge and are a platform challenging our existing beliefs with critical new ideas. This is much needed, not only by the students and think tanks to whom this is primarily addressed, but also to all the partnering organizations, including my own. It was Ryszard Kapuscinski, a talented Polish journalist, who said that a journey, after all, neither begins in the instant we set out, nor ends when we have reached our doorstep once again. It starts much earlier and is really never over. because the film of memory continues running on inside of us long after we have come to a physical standstill. This resonates deeply with us at UNDP as well as with our partners in the European Commission. Our organizations, with a long-term commitment to sustainable development at the core of our raison d'être. As the latest Human Development Report shows, today's world gives us reasons for both optimism as well as motivation to work harder. The main message, to look beyond the averages, emphasizes the growing inequalities, some of which we'll hope hear about today. Although millions no longer struggle with the most basic of needs, like low life expectancy at birth or illiteracy, millions more still have no access to what we now know as dignified life. A new generation of inequalities, such as weak public institutions, access to broadband and tertiary education, are setting back the communities who have just climbed out of poverty. The Agenda 2030, comprising of 17 Sustainable Development Goals, is at the heart of our work, be it in UNDP Strategic Plan or the European Union's Africa-Europe Alliance and the European External Investment Plan. Today's lecture is particularly relevant as the global goals are built on the values of freedom and liberty, and, most importantly, the communal responsibility of the entire global population to make them happen. Redressing inequalities in human development in the 21st century is possible only if we all work together on it. Official development assistance, or ODA, such as the commendable €76 billion by development aid's largest donor, the European Union, and its member states, are essential in enabling the achievement of the SDGs. But we should also stress the important contribution by private investment and domestic resources. And above all, we should never forget that a lot of the thinking and work for this is going to happen in places like this one. Let me finally invite you all to share the message of liberty and freedom. Let me remind you that this lecture is live streamed and interactive, and I invite the audience both here and online to use the hashtag CapTalks to share your comments and questions, which will be addressed at the end of the lecture. Thank you once again.
Well, thank you, Ivan. Now let me allow me to say a few lines with regard to the roles, consequences, and impacts of institutions in economic life within the discipline of economics. There has always been an attention to institutions, although the extent of attention has varied a lot. If you look at, for example, Adam Smith, one of his books, Moral Sentiments, is about institutions. And then you have a wide range of economists, or as in the earlier times known as political economists, devoted their times and energies to the concept of institutions. But somehow, with the development of the modern discipline of economics, institutions somehow got disappeared. And then, if you wish, there has been a revisit to that very concept, and so people have been investigating how institutions, formal and informal, have established order, dealt with uncertainties, promoted cooperation, and all these things have been investigated by the so-called New Institutional School. And Daron has been one of the leading figures. He's currently an institute professor at MIT, and he has published lots of articles and books on that subject. And Why Nations Fail is, one of the most well-known pieces that I am sure most of us have read, not only once, but many times. Daron holds lots of honorary doctorates from a wide range of universities, but I'm very proud that Boğaziçi University is one among them. So without taking much of your time, let me introduce please Daron here, and then we'll have a Q&A session. Daron.
Thank you, Fikret. Thank you, Ipek. Thank you, Ivan. And thanks to Bosphorus University for hosting me here. And thanks to all of you for being here. Teşekkürler. İngilizce konuşacağız bundan sonra. So it's great to be back at Bosphorus. And today it's very meaningful for me to have an opportunity to share with you some of the ideas that James Robinson and I developed in the context of our new book, The Narrow Corridor, States, Societies, and the Fate of Liberty. I'm not going to give a summary of the book. My purpose is to tell you why we wrote the book, where we're coming from, and what we are trying to achieve. But I'm going to do that in the context of some of the main themes of the book. This is a photograph from an environmental protest. Literally dozens of these take place every month around the world. Well, not everywhere, not in Turkey. You know, protests are not that easy in Turkey. But in most other countries, you can see events like this quite frequently. Nothing exceptional, you might think. The starting point of the book is that this is extremely exceptional. From the viewpoint of the long history of humanity on this planet, this is as unusual as anything we have achieved, including the cell phone or the internet. To our ancestors who grew up, who lived in the context of what anthropologists call small-scale societies, this would have been unthinkable. You know, people here of very different walks of life. You can see parents with their children, students, teachers, professionals, coming together for a purpose that is not their immediate livelihood. That's one exceptional thing. But the second is even more staggering. They're doing so because they're asking the government, the state, to do something that it's not doing. So they're actually asking the powers that be, the state institutions, I'll talk more about them, to shoulder greater responsibilities. That would have been completely unthinkable, of course, to people who in small-scale societies because they did not have states, and any kind of political power and political hierarchy was the most threatening thing to them, so that's why they developed a very complex set of norms in order to prevent all these sorts of social hierarchies, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. When finally states made their appearance in human history, they were despotic, repressive, and intent on reorganizing society for the benefit, economic, social, and political benefit of those who held power. So it would have been also unthinkable for the citizens of those societies to actually get into the street, get into the public square, and protest and demand anything from the state. The state would not have listened to them. It would not have occurred to them that the state could even listen to them. And of course, if they did something like this, they would have been duly put in jail or worse. But sometimes, through some process, evolved that we actually, many of us, not everybody, not people in China, not people in Saudi Arabia, well, perhaps somewhat people in Turkey, but most people around the world actually think this is an okay thing. Actually, many people take part in it. How did we get there? Well, I want to tell you the story of how we got there, but I also want to argue that this is the essence of liberty. This is the essence of liberty in two senses. Because liberty is really about individuals making choices without the undue influence, without asking permission from anybody, including leaders, norms, economically powerful individuals, and having the opportunity to do so. So this sort of public display of political participation is part and parcel of it, but more importantly, it's also a guarantor of that liberty, as I will try to explain. And one conceptual picture to give you the idea is this, which acts as the organizing framework of the book. In it, James and I greatly simplify the long durée of economic and political history and reduce it to two variables. Of course, a gross simplification, but hopefully useful in the context that I want to cover. One is power of society, and the other is the power of the state. So in this part, where the power of the state is much greater than the power of society, you have what we call despotic states, states that are too powerful for society to contend with. Think of your garden variety empire, or dictator, or autocrat, or whatever you want. And its distinguishing feature isn't violence. Violence does happen in many of these states, violence against citizens, but its distinguishing feature is the inability of citizens to affect the direction of public policy, the choices, the social choices. Moreover, the arrows here, which are meant to represent the dynamic evolution of the capacities of states and society, are telling a particular story. They're telling you that in this region, these despotic states, like those in China, for example, will not only dominate society, they will also weaken society because they do not want to have the society to contend with them, to make demands, to keep them accountable. In this part, here, we have the opposite configuration. So here, state institutions are very weak, without the capacity to do anything that we take for granted from any self-respecting state. Regulate economic activity, impose laws, resolve disputes, use force against people if need be. Instead, you have a complex of norms and traditions that regulate conflict, that create their own social hierarchies, but also undercut any attempt by would-be strongmen to rise and build any type of proto-state. That's why the arrows here show this downward trajectory, meaning that there's really no room for the states to grow much within this space. So there are many contemporary examples, but the best illustration of these come from small-scale societies that have been studied by ethnographers like the Tiv in central Nigeria, which I'll say a few words about in a second. Now, this is the eponymous narrow corridor. This is where the title of the book comes from. And it is a corridor squeezed in between these two areas. But what's distinguishing about it is that some very different processes transpire within this corridor. You can get an inkling of that first from the fact that these arrows look very different than those ones. They're not the weakening of one side because of the dominance of the other. They are about the two sides becoming stronger together. What is that about? This is the heart of the book. We argue, and I'm going to go into some of those details, that the exceptional thing and the origins of that picture of people coming into the public square and protesting really come from the fact that both state and society have become much stronger. They have become much stronger in two important senses. The first one is that both state and society have greater capacities than you can see from most historical polities. So the state is capable of taking climate action against climate change. That's why people are demanding it. That's a very, very complex problem. That's not the only complex problem. Routinely, modern states deal with dozens of complex problems, from economic to social to technological, every day. They are also capable of providing myriad public services, regulations, and so on. But at the same time, society has a much greater capacity. if you use the strategies that stateless societies had in a modern state like the United States or Turkey or the UK, of course, they would not be very powerful. It's really the ability of the state, of the society, to develop a much more institutionalized way, working through elections, civil society, media, and other organizations that is at the root of that greater capacity. But also, there is another sense to this development. During this process, the relationship between state and society is changing. Imagine you're going into a business deal. Why do you trust your business partner? One answer is, well, I know my business partner, he or she will never cheat me. Actually, when you inquire people, that's not the reason that they give, implicitly or explicitly. It's that if they actually cheated, I could go to the court. There is a set of institutions. So I actually trust institutions more than somebody I've actually getting into business. I'm willing to do business with and I've known for a very long time. So there's a deep trust in institutions that evolves over this process. And it is critical. If you didn't trust the institutions, not that they will do the right thing, not that they won't do the right thing, but they have that capacity and they will listen to you and they won't take whatever you ask from them and turn it upside down. That trust is critical in the motivation of the people who actually gather in the public square. Now, what I will argue and come back to at the end is that this has astonishingly important implications for how the economy is organized and how social relations work. Liberty is one part of it, and I will come to that. But let me actually start from the economy. So I want to illustrate with just two charts, because we don't have much time, two striking patterns, which, of course, are not directly about what I have explained so far, but are indicative of the same processes. So one is about democracy. Well, they're both about democracy. One is about economic growth, the other one is about distribution. So democracy is not the same as being in the corridor. There are several democratic countries that hold regular elections, but would have various sorts of dominances ingrained in their structure deeply. And if you go back in history, early societies that have arguably entered the corridor, and I'll give some examples thereof, were not democratic. But today there is an elective affinity between democracy and being in the corridor because, as I've already emphasized, democratic institutionalization of the power of the powerless, of the regular citizens, is a critical component of the power of society. And so one question that you might ask is, what does democracy do to economic growth? And that's an important question because in this day and age, we are continuously told that democracy is dysfunctional, that going in the direction of democracy would be economic suicide, and we should emulate China, we should emulate other countries that have a single leader, a powerful strongman at top, and not let the hurly-burly of democratic politics get in the way of good policies. Well, actually, the truth is quite the opposite, and that is critical for my argument because the nature of economic growth is both more innovative and more inclusive in the corridor. More innovative because you need the energy of society that cooperates and participates in every dimension of life, and more inclusive because top-down economic growth, which no doubt happens, look at China, is not going to bring the same sort of shared gains. So here is a very simple chart that I will put as Exhibit 1 in that claim. So what I do here is I classify every country since 1950 as democracy or non-democracy, and then we are looking at democratic transitions, so countries that go from 0 to 1. So therefore, you're not comparing apples and oranges. You're not comparing China to Switzerland. They're completely different countries. You're looking at the question of what does a country do before it's democratic, after it's democratic. And just look at the simplest measure of economic progress, GDP per capita. Now, 0 is every country that transitions from non-democracy to democracy is centered at 0. Okay? So you're saying here, how do countries that democratize do relative to other non-democracies that remain non-democracies in that year? Now you see two things that are important, and I'll come back to them. The first one is that before zero, which means these are the years before democracy, typically there is a decline in GDP per capita. That's a very robust pattern. Dictators and autocrats don't generally, sometimes there are exceptions, but don't generally leave out of their own volition. They go because they are forced to go. And they are forced to go when things don't go well. So the critical times for autocrats is when the economy tumbles. So that's why you have this down. But then look what happens. Right after democracy, there is no economic miracle. The economy starts growing, reverses the pattern a little bit. But look at it, within the next 20, 25 years, you have about a 20 percentage point higher GDP per capita. That's a very remarkable growth. You know, few things, even manna from heaven, wouldn't get you that much growth. So, at least in all of the data we have, the future is not known. Well, perhaps China would be the only economic success, and perhaps in the future everything will be different. But in the data we have, there is no support for the claim that democracies are worse and autocracies are better. Quite the opposite. And the growth of democracies, and again in line with the nature of things being different, in the corridor is rather distinct from what you see in non-democracies. Things become much more widely shared. And so here I'm showing you one aspect of that, infant health, infant mortality. So right after democratization, you see a huge drop in infant mortality. Why? Very clear. Democracies increase taxes and start investing in education and health expenditures, of course, give you dividends in terms of the most vulnerable, in particular infants. I could show you several other figures showing the same pattern. Democracies, just with that elective affinity to being in the corridor, create a very different type of economy. More based on bottom-up participation, more emphasis on technological progress, faster growth, and more broader gains from that growth. So, how do we make the corridor work? What are the forces that put us in there and that make this upward heading trajectories tick? Well, I'm going to start, I'm getting confused because there are two screens here, and I'm getting like, okay, so I'll just head here, look here, and then I'm less likely to get confused. So I'm going to start telling that story with this shard of broken pottery. Those of you who can read Greek will recognize the name of Themistocles. Themistocles was the closest thing with Pericles, but Themistocles much more, in my opinion. The closest thing that ancient Athens, the birthplace of democracy according to some, had as hero. He was an inspiring leader. He saw the threat from Persians. He single-handedly convinced Athenians to organize a navy. Then he led that navy, saving Athens. Then he recognized the threat from Sparta. He campaigned for turning Athens' attention against Sparta. But he was ostracized and sent away to exile from Athens for 10 years. That was a unique Athenian institution, the law of ostracism that Cleisthenes introduced in 6th century BC. According to the law of ostracism, everywhere the assembly were Athenian men, all had the vote except the slaves. There were slaves, so we'll come to that. And that assembly democratically decided whether there would be an ostracism. If the vote was for an ostracism, then every Athenian citizen would write the name of a person on a broken piece of pottery called an ostrakon, hence the word ostracism, and whosever name was written most frequently was ostracized for 10 years from Athens. Think about it. What is that institution doing there? Was it a the outcome of a drunken night. No, it actually served a purpose, and you can see traces of it in previous social norms. Athenians and Athenian democracy critically depended on its ability to control the elite. Those were the struggles that led to the formation of the institutions, and those struggles defined the working of Athenian democracy. And the real threat wasn't just economic, wasn't just political, it was social. People getting too big for their boots, dominating others, telling others what to do, and setting up a deep social hierarchy. And the tool of ostracism was very much an attempt to deal with that problem. If you get too big for your boots, even if you're Themistocles, you're going to get ostracized. That distrust of power was what animated Athenian democracy. It isn't unique to Athenian democracy. It is actually visible in every domain of every human interaction. It is made weaker. It is made prostate, meek, in societies where you have a despotic leader who tells you all wisdom comes from him or her, most often him, but it is even present in the most despotic societies. And you see it very clearly among the small-scale societies. The Tiv, who have been studied by the husband-wife team of Bohanons for over 20 years, is a perfect illustration. All of the social norms of Tivs, from the social to the political to the economic, are organized around cutting down the would-be bossy strongman. Too much display of power, you're cut down. Too much wealth, you're cut down. Try to use the market in order to accumulate more power, no, that's not allowed. There is an incredible suspicion of political inequality, which then spills into economic inequality in many of these societies. But the Tiv dealt with that by preventing all kinds of state building. So why the Athenians? How did they actually manage it differently? Well, the key is that the Tiv did not have the institutional setup for scaling up that distrust of power into anything that could control a modern state. So the genius of Athenians, through a process of going over 200 years, was to develop institutions that could do the role that crazy-looking norms among the Tiv, like witchcraft, or no, those goods cannot be traded type of attitudes. No, we can allow you to undertake economic activity, but then we have the tools to rein you in. Not a bad thing, so this ostracism should be considered in modern societies. Who do you think would be ostracized? So, now, Athens is, of course, special. Some draw the links, some see the origins of modern democracy in Athens. Some ways that is true. Some others argue European democracies and European laws that are perhaps more protective of liberty than in many other places, they go back to the Romans, they go back to European culture, they go back to European geography, they go back to European values. Well, there is some truth to many of these claims, but in fact, we emphasize something quite different, and something really about the corridor. What really set Europe apart wasn't just the Greek heritage, wasn't just the Roman heritage, it wasn't European values or European geography, it was a fortuitous balance that emerged during a particular historical juncture. Specifically, after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, two things coincided in Europe. A history, a blueprint, a memory, an understanding of how centralized administrative institutions of the form of the later Roman Empire worked, all of those institutional prerequisites, but a power vacuum that then created a political equilibrium that was very different from the Roman one. In particular, with the fall of the Western Roman Empire, Europe was run over by Germanic tribes, in particular Franks, that had a very different set of political traditions. And most distinguishing around their political traditions is that for their time, for 5th, 6th century, they had quite remarkably participatory political institutions. This is what some historians call the assembly politics of the Germanic tribes. Many decisions were made in assemblies, and even powerful warrior kings had temporary authority from the assemblies who had to validate their decisions, who had to give them legitimacy. This is Hincmar of Reims. Unfortunately, we don't have many in-person account. This is Hincmar of Reims, comes way after the early Franks. The Franks are an amalgamation of other Germanic tribes coming to focus with the Merovingians, and then after the Merovingians fall after 200 years, you have the Carolingians, so built by Charlemagne. So Hincmar of Reims was a teacher for Carloman III, a great-grandson of Charlemagne, and he was teaching him how he should reign over his realm. And he said, forget the idea that you rule this country. You need the approval of the assemblies. And he describes what these assemblies are. One for the elites, one for the regular people. Information has to be spread. They need to approve your decisions. And this is actually, 800 years, 700 years after what Tacitus describes about earlier, or Julius Caesar a little bit after Tacitus, about early Germanic tribes. It's remarkably the same. It's exactly the same two assemblies, exactly the same division, that the chiefs become powerful during times of war, but not otherwise, and this legitimation, assembly, bottom-up decision, bottom-up communication. So these two, somewhat unique, not all unique. You have similar things among the Mongols, but perhaps some a little bit different. Of course, you have other bureaucratic institutions in China, around the same time, just like the Roman ones. But this confluence of these two semi-unique features was what set Europe into the beginning of the corridor here. So you have the power and capacity of centralized institutions, Roman law, for instance, and the ability of society to participate in politics. And it is that process that we argue put many European places inside the corridor in which they fluctuated wildly back, forth, sometimes out, but have, by very broad outlines, have also followed these trajectories of upward. But this corridor, and the European story, by the way, also emphasize that liberty is not static. It's something that you achieve over time. It's a process. That is obvious in the case of Merovingians, for example. Merovingians would repel us today. They were violent, they had slaves, women had completely subservient positions, they were deeply and confusingly religious. After Clovis, their first emperor, converted to Christianity as a political gesture, they became deeply ingrained with the Catholic doctrine. But over time, this development of state institutions started changing things. And it changed things in a number of ways, some of which I have already mentioned, but some are also quite distinct and important, worth emphasizing. Some of the process was about norms changing. And what do I mean by that? Well, I've described the norms that you have in these small-scale societies. They were effective in keeping people too big for their britches in check, but they were extremely stifling. And they created these amazingly deep social hierarchies. I am superior to you because of my gender, because of my age, because of various other social roles that I play. And those norms themselves were an impediment to liberty. So part of this process was the change in those norms. And let me give an example from India to illustrate that. This is a manual scavenger. Manual scavengers, sorry, just before dinner, Their job is to clear animal carcasses and human waste. So they spend their working day in the most unsanitary conditions. Very short life expectancy, amazingly unhealthy, hugely unpleasant work. There are perhaps as many as 5 million manual scavengers in India. Who are they? Well, it turns out almost all of them are Dalits. Dalits, or the untouchables, are the bottom caste in India. There are about 200 million of them in India. 200 million Dalits. Not all of them are manual scavengers, obviously, but they all perform the most menial tasks. Many occupations are closed to them. They are completely socially discriminated. Until quite recently, many of them could not attend the same schools as regular Indian kids. If they attended the same schools, they had to sit separate not to pollute the water or the seats that other Indian kids were using. Is that law? Not, absolutely not. Indian law, Indian constitution upon independence from Britain at the end of World War II was written by one of the most inspiring people in 20th century history, a man named Ambedkar, who was himself a Dalit. He himself was shunned throughout life, but he was a brilliant person. Even though he was refused education, he had to go to school eating, drinking separately. He rose up, he became a lawyer, and he became a human rights activist, and he convinced, against Gandhi and Nehru, by the way, to make dealing with caste hierarchy a key part of the Indian constitution. Gandhi objected, but Ambedkar finally prevailed, and the Indian constitution is extremely clear. There is no discrimination on the basis of caste. In fact, there are many safeguards in Indian constitution against caste-based discrimination. So how come we have this story? Well, we have it because it's not the law. It's the norms that create the cage of norms. It's the norms that create the cage which trapped 200 million Dalits in India. And it is that cage that needs to be broken. India can never become a modern democracy as long as that cage's vestiges remain, and the same is true for many other countries. So how do we break the norms? Well, let's think of another norm that somehow got broken, but only partially, gender-based. So there's no doubt that anybody who tells the history of democracy or liberty would see Britain as one of the turning points after 1832, especially, where the first Reform Act extended voting rights to middle-class men, and the second and the third Reform Acts expanded the franchise. Britain is at the forefront of democracy. You have to say they are in the corridor somehow. But emphasizing that liberty is a process, things were very different for women. In still second half of the 19th century, British women had no vote, had no political voice, but had absolutely no economic rights either. Women could not inherit money, they could not open their businesses, they did not even have any say about how their children would be educated or would do. So their husbands could decide to take their children away and they would not have no say. So that started to change very late. Again, it's a process. And another 70 years, things look very different in the UK. So how did it change? Well, one view, which is perhaps the most common one when it comes to every aspect of liberty, which says, well, we designed good institutions and we prevented, with the leadership of enlightened people, this sort of discrimination. And you can find your founding father for Turkey, for the US, for the UK, and say they are the ones who are responsible for liberty. In the US, it would be the founding fathers, Madison, Jefferson, Washington. But actually, the story is very different in every case. It was always bottom-up demands that frustrated the plans of those leaders that led to liberty. And those leaders, when they were unrivaled in their plans, that didn't really lead to liberty. So this is the United Arab Emirates way of dealing with the cage of norms and trapping women. So this gentleman here, Sheikh Al Maktoum, the ruler of Dubai, instituted a Gender Balance Award in the year 2017 to deal with the situation of women. So in the 2018, he's presenting the gender awards. So what do you see that's common among these 4 gentlemen who are getting the award? They're all gentlemen. So all of the gender balance awards went to men. And that's not uncommon when you have top-down schemes for improving things. Now, how did it work in the US or the UK? Well, first, women got the vote, so they got political voice, but that was only part of the story. Then the social norms had to change, and that's the part of the process. If you give the women the vote, but they are discriminated in family, in workplaces, in the social eyes of their peers as well as men, that's not going to be empowerment. So real freedom came from the social norms that started slowly, ever so slowly, and they're still in the process of changing. Now, all of this asks questions about history. So what about all of those structural factors, what political scientists and sociologists call structural factors, all of these big events of history? Aren't they important for understanding where state capacity emerges, where you have these strong states? Well, of course, everything is important, but not as much as the previous literature has emphasized. So in particular, one of the most dominant views in political science is one summarized by the political sociologist Charles Tilly. States made war and war made the state. So the argument is you see very different states and a very different political dynamics when you are engaged in war making, because that necessitates building state institutions and resources in the hands of the state. But for every structural factor like this, be it war making, be it trade, be it the type of crops, be it geography, you find several examples and as many counterexamples. So what's up with that? Well, our framework helps us understand. So it's all about getting into the corridor. Why? You can have despotic states, but despotic states are only high capacity relative to these absent or dysfunctional states. The true state capacity comes out of this process where you start trusting institutions, society and state contesting power, and in the process cooperating. So that's about getting into the corridor. Indeed, Tilly is right. There are examples in history, like Switzerland, which was a disparate set of mountain farmers that were very suspicious of political power, very well armed, and very unwilling to obtain any type of central authority. But when they feel themselves completely threatened by the Holy Roman Empire's invasion, they band together and form the Swiss Confederacy. Centralization of political power, they form a unified army, they set up laws to deal with the endemic blood feuds that were ongoing. Nothing like that happens in Montenegro. Montenegrins fight the Ottomans all the time, as many people in this room learn from your history books. They fight very well sometimes, but they never centralize political power. It depends on where you are in this figure. The same impetus can get you a temporary organization, which is what the Montenegrins did when they fought the Ottomans, but not get you into a different institutional path, or it may get you into the corridor. But then, in the case of Prussia, when Frederick William I came to power right after the Great War, 30-year War, and realized how his country was ravaged, he completely changed track, which the Prussians already, at the time, had essentially had a developed or evolved version of the same assemblies that their German forefathers had. And he said, I'm going to change this. I'm going to build a much stronger army. How did he do that? The first thing he did, he sidelined the very powerful at the time assemblies, the parliaments of Prussia and Brandenburg. Then he introduced very heavy taxes on land so that all the resources could be centralized in the hands of the power, in the hands of the state. Then he introduced a heavy form of conscription so that he got all of the men, especially physically fit men, into the army. Completely reorganized society into a military way so that Voltaire would say, normal states have armies. In Prussia, the army has a state for itself. But that was going out of the corridor. So this actually is a very important observation, in my opinion, if only I say so. Shocks that have the same form will have very different implications depending on where you are and depending how you use them. And I want to use that insight for thinking about another set of challenges that many of us worry about, perhaps keeping some of us up at night. New technology creating a surveillance state or surveillance system with companies. So this is Tiananmen Square. These are facial recognition cameras. I don't know how well they work, but they are there. And they're not the only tool that the Chinese state uses as a modern technology for monitoring protest activity. You don't see people protesting in Tiananmen Square. But that's not enough. The Chinese system uses a complex AI in order to track every activity, and so you create a unified map of your online and offline activity so that good behavior can be rewarded and bad behavior be punished. And where do you think criticizing the government falls into, good or bad? So many people worry that this sort of use of technology is going to mean the end of freedom. Is it so? Well, this perspective suggests, well, perhaps that's a strengthening of the state that might get us out of the corridor, but it would depend on how we use it, how we contend with it, how we confront it with increased capabilities of society, and where we are in terms of our balances. The effect of AI technology on China need not be the same as the one in Turkey or the one in Nigeria or the one in Switzerland. So how do we think about that? Well, we can use this framework, but let me apply that framework to some prior concerns about similar things. The great economist, Friedrich Hayek, has shaped political and economic thinking in the 20th century as much as anybody. In 1942, Hayek was an emigre from Vienna teaching at the London School of Economics, my alma mater. London School of Economics' director at the time was a name called William Beveridge, who came up, or he led a team of bureaucrats, civil servants, to write what became known as the Beveridge Report. Beveridge Report was a blueprint for the British welfare state that got immediately implemented during the war, in the middle of the war. It legislated, or it recommended things like minimum wage, national health insurance, social security, aid for needy children, disability insurance, lots of safety regulations. It was completely transformative. It was probably a very important ingredient for Britain not folding, because the British people, the working class people, got completely energized by this promise of a very different political system. James Griffiths, who became Minister of Labor after the war, said, in one of the darkest hours of the war, in the end of 1932, the Beveridge Report fell like manna from heaven. But Hayek was worried. He thought this looked very much like a form of new totalitarianism. He first wrote a letter to Beveridge, then turned that into an article, and then turned that into a book, which became The Road to Serfdom. What Hayek was worried about was that this new, if you want to call it technology or capability, this administrative state, was going to be the dominance of the state and elites over society and the end of freedom. In his own words, which sound very similar in some ways to the imagery that I try to present in the form of the corridor, he says, this means, among other things, that even a strong tradition of political liberty is no safeguard if the danger is precisely that new institutions and policies will gradually undermine and destroy that spirit. So what he's saying is that you may be in the corridor here, but make the state much stronger, and you'll get out of the corridor. But Hayek was mistaken. He was mistaken for two reasons. He was first mistaken because he had an unduly narrow conception of liberty. For Hayek, liberty meant the state doesn't interfere. So any administration, any extension of the power, administrative power of the state, to him meant a threat for liberty. Well, that is a threat to liberty, but you have to balance that against the need for individuals having opportunities in order to exercise that freedom. And the real threat during the Great Depression and its aftermath, and likely to recur in the minds of many people, including Beveridge, was that because economic hardship would be so severe, at least periodically, that people would not have the means to be free. And in fact, William Beveridge himself vehemently denied any label of socialist, and he wrote a book called Why I'm a Liberal. And his view of liberal was that you need to protect people against the economic dominance of others. So that was very much a deeper way of thinking about liberty than Hayek. But the second reason why Hayek was mistaken is because he thought that if you increase the state's power, that's it. But reality wasn't like that. What happened in Britain, and even earlier in the Scandinavian countries, was that as the state was asked to shoulder greater responsibilities, society also became more involved in politics and more intent in monitoring the state that is now more capable and more powerful. So what kept most of Europe in the post-war era in this corridor, and in fact led to perhaps the greatest 40 years in European history in terms of growth, equality, social services, political liberties flourishing, was that as the state became stronger, so did political participation bottom up. And it is that process that the Swedes actually understood, because the whole hallmark of Swedish social democracy, led by the Swedish Workers' Party in 1932, was we built a broad coalition, first bringing workers and peasants together. That's why it was called the Red-Green Coalition, or the cow trade. And then we bring the businessmen together, and the businessmen were from the get-go part of that coalition. It wasn't based on expropriating businessmen. It wasn't based on punitive taxation of the businessmen. It was based on a compact for creating a social welfare state together with an economic environment which would generate economic growth, productivity growth, high-wage jobs, which was the key of the collective bargaining structure of Sweden. So the essence which the Swedes captured was the balance of power, that it was a situation in which you made the state more responsive, more responsible, while at the same time making it more responsive, which meant society getting stronger. So, what does this framework then tell us about the other question? Not of staying in the corridor, but of getting into it. Well, one of the interesting things about the framework is that it emphasizes there are multiple ways of getting into the corridor. If you start as a despotic state, the way to get into the corridor is for society to get stronger. But if you start as an extremely disorganized state, the way to get into society is for the state's capacity to increase and its laws to be more obeyed. So completely diametric. What's needed in Russia, what's needed in China is very different from what's needed in Nigeria. And if you start down here, which many African and some Central American regions are, then you need a simultaneous strengthening of both. And this one actually is the most interesting in some sense because it really underscores the simultaneous building of trust in institutions. So, what examples we have of this sort of move into the corridor illustrate is that leadership does matter. Somebody needs to become the face of a new type of politics, a new type of public service, but that person has to immediately start building trust in institutions, and often from conditions where that trust is sorely missing. So it is a simultaneous deepening of the power of the state, tax collection, regulation of economic activity, law enforcement, refuse collection, basic public services, while at the same time you make the state more open to criticism, more open to influence. It is best captured by Fashola, one of the mayors of Lagos, which started as one of the most dreadful places in the world, crime-ridden, very, very dysfunctional. Nothing worked and transformed itself completely in the course of about 10 years. Fashola gave his cell phone number to citizens so that they could call him if the public services weren't working. That is a very different type of politics than what you are used to. But you see that it happens. But it also underscores, again, going back to this question, really, if you want to stay into the corridor, you do need to cherish that trust. You need the trust to get into the corridor, but if you are in the corridor and you lose that trust between states and institutions, you do leave yourself vulnerable for spinning out of the corridor. And why is that important? Well, because one aspect of the threat in the current environment is that there is increasing dissatisfaction and discontent. A lot of that is related to a notion of economic gains being unfairly captured by a small segment. But that really says it is critical to deal with it, because what we are seeing around the world is that this notion, this sense of unfair inequality building up, those who control power looking after their interests while the rest are not benefiting from technology and globalization, that is a recipe for destroying the trust in power. So, and the way to deal with it, just like the Beveridge report, just like what the Swedish Workers' Party understood, is that you have to deal with both the root causes and some of the ramifications of that inequality. Better social safety net, better effort for building opportunities for everybody. And if you don't do that, you are in danger, because that trust being eroded is going to take you out of the corridor. But if you do that, you're in danger too. Because Hayek wasn't completely wrong. If you do that while getting the balance of power right, then you're going to be in trouble as well. Now, I also wanted to say a few words about Turkey, but I am already out of time, so let me be brief in that. What I want to sort of highlight is that Turkey, in some sense, has had several opportunities to enter the corridor, but hasn't generally used them. And the reason why it hasn't used them is because what moving into the corridor means is for society's power over politicians and leaders to get deeper. And that hasn't happened in Turkey. And when that doesn't happen, it is impossible to get all of the other things that you need to have from being inside the corridor. And I will just show you two more pictures to summarize that. One is that, as I emphasized, inside the corridor, you get growth, but you get a different kind of growth. So what you see in Turkey is that, especially over the last 20 years, you do have growth, but that growth is not high-quality growth. And it's not high-quality growth by one simple measure, well, I can show you others, which is that what economists call the total factor productivity, how efficiently we're using our physical capital, human capital, labor. That's negative or zero in Turkey for most of the period. And it's our inability to improve the structure of the economy, the productivity of the economy that is at the root of this. So if you look at what Turkey exports, these are medium tech and high tech products. We export no high tech products. The medium tech products, they increased for a while, but they stayed constant. We essentially export low tech products, and that's where the source of economic growth. So all of those are related to not being in the corridor. They're the economic aspects of it. And whereas if you look at other countries that are our peers, they paint a very different picture. And the consequences of that type of low-quality growth are, of course, inequality. So if you look at Turkish inequality, it's actually at Latin American levels. We're on a par with Chile and Argentina. It falls for a while with the growth expansion in the 2000s, but then it strikes up all the way to Brazilian, Chilean levels. And, of course, all of this, as the narrow corridor highlights, is all about political participation. And as I have emphasized time and again, political participation means bottom-up participation. It needs to be through a variety of channels. It needs to be through political parties, it needs to be through social media, civil society organizations, and it needs to be through media. But Turkey tops the league of journalist jailers. We actually house about a quarter of all journalists who are in prison in Turkey at the moment. But that, of course, is completely inconsistent with politics inside the corridor because muzzled society cannot be part of the corridor. So in sum, the corridor is hard work. It's not easy to get into it, it's easy to get out of it, and it is not going to be a gift from leaders. It is something society demands, and if it really works at it, and if the conditions are opportune, and if the right strategies are pursued, society, together with better laws and better state institutions, can be a conduit for the corridor, which then can change the nature of economic growth and the nature of liberty in society. But threats to that liberty will be ever present, and the only way we can safeguard it is by understanding what it brings and also ensuring to work that balance of power at every turn. Thank you. How are we going to do this? Efendim? Yok sen al. Çünkü online sorular da geliyor. Öyle mi? Okay, o zaman tamam. O zaman ben yapayım. Okay. We're just talking about how the online questions will be transmitted. Please.
Daron Bey, thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. Truly enjoyed it. Very informative. My question is actually I have twofold. One is in the charts that you have shown. After 25 years, we see a decline in the chart. Do you have any ideas around that?
Democracy chart.
Yeah, exactly.
That's. I'll take that immediately, and then I can take your second question.
Okay.
That's just, things become. I didn't put standard errors around here. If you put standard errors, they're all wild after. So these are not very precisely estimated. So it's really up to this 20 years that you should think about. So there are a lot of other things going on. So this is unconditional, meaning that you're not conditioning on democracy surviving. So after 20, 25 years, many democracies are going back out, so it's getting very imprecise. So it's really this region here is precisely estimated.
And the second question is, what do you think, what is your prediction for China?
Well, I think, the framework forces us into a China answer. Not everybody may like it, but China is the quintessential example of this despotic path. So what it means is that it is really the place where for 2,500 years you've had an essentially meek society. It wasn't always like that. In Chinese history, if you go back to 800 BC, for example, you have what the Chinese historians call the spring and autumn period, which they describe it a little bit like the Italian communes. Much more political participation, much less top-down control. But after the Warring State period, where there were huge casualties with 100 years of wars, the Qin state, and with this legalist philosophy of Lord Shang, was victorious and followed a very different reorganization of society, very top-down, and every Chinese dynasty since then has followed that. So as a result, you have a relatively high capacity, for example, as captured by the meritocratic bureaucratic system, examination system, but also met by a very meek society in China. So that makes it much harder for China to get into the corridor than, say, Turkey to get into the corridor. In Chile, you have a bloody dictatorship of Pinochet. You would think after Pinochet's dictatorship, Chile has no chance, but it has a much better chance because, where do you're in the corridor, you have a dictatorship, but you're still in the vicinity of the corridor. It's much easier to build on those existing political traditions. What political traditions will the Chinese build on? But it is very important to emphasize, this is not a cultural story. It is not saying that the Chinese don't have the culture. You see that in Hong Kong, exactly the same culture, amazing overlap with the Chinese culture in every respect, but an incredible thirst for democracy. It's about organization of state and society.
Daron, I have just received a related question. Why do infant mortality and economic inequality increase again in the later stages of democratization?
So yeah, as I said in response to the previous question, they don't. It's just when you go out 25 years, things are becoming imprecise there.
Thank you.
Yes, please. I think the microphone is coming.
Thank you. So, will then the Southeast Asian economic tigers challenge the argument that democracy is a necessity for economic growth?
So, I think I want to thank you for asking that question, because I went over that rapidly. I tried to say it, but it was too quick. So the argument isn't that economic growth is inconsistent with despotism. In fact, economic growth often, or not often, but sometimes flourishes under despotic control. And you can see that. Compare a despotic state that enforces laws, has the capacity to invest, has the capacity to develop technology or take technology from abroad, relative to a chaotic system like either complete absence or complete dysfunction of institutions. Of course, economic growth is more likely here. The argument is that economic growth is harder to maintain because the innovative energy, you cannot will it into existence with top-down control. So innovation is harder, and it becomes more unequal. And, you know, the East Asian tigers are not inconsistent with that claim. Look at South Korea. Some people will tell you South Korean growth story is all about General Park and his iron grip. Well, that's true. South Korea did grow under General Park and his top-down industrial policy, but actually if you look at the data, South Korean growth and equality, by the way, really flourish after the transition to democracy. So all of the technological leadership of South Korea that we sort of take granted today was really developed after the late 1980s. And wages increased during that time, income inequality improved significantly in South Korea, and over time the power of these companies and their corrupt practices are still being, you know, they're not completely gone, but they're still being cut down. Same thing in Taiwan. Now, Singapore is a bit different, but it's exceptional for other reasons. But the South Asia is also consistent with both the demand for democracy. You know, in South Korea, again, democracy didn't come because the generals decided. In fact, there was a strong union movement and a strong student movement. They went onto the streets. First, the army shot them and imprisoned quite a bit of them and killed a couple dozens. But then they had to give in under a variety of international and domestic circumstances. But so in that sense, both how democracy came and what democracy did, as well as the nature of the impulse for democracy, are very common. Yes, please.
Whether Turkey has been on a despotic path, what is your answer on that?
Turkey, yes, but it's not new. Turkey has been on a despotic path. I think it has periodically had opportunities to change course, but it hasn't generally succeeded.
And how that despotic path affecting the Turkey's economic growth? Does it feeding the economic crisis in Turkey?
I think it does, and that's what I wanted to emphasize here, and let me take 1 minute to do that. You know, if you look at various indicators, so here you have the economic reforms. According to international organizations, there was an improvement in many of these things around 2000s, especially after the financial crisis, and the World Bank and IMF programs really required various changes both in how government money was spent, how it was collected, how it was made more transparent, as well as financial and product market reforms. This went hand in hand with various political reforms. So you see the political rights indices, say, for example, from Freedom House, hitting rock bottom in the 1990s and then improving in the early 2000s. And that is, even though it was very imperfect, it was ham-handed, but it was still important in changing the Turkish growth trajectory and potential. That's the one period during which you see very, very powerful total factor productivity growth. That's the one period in which you see the structure of exports becoming much more technology intensive. And you see a variety of other things which look very different. But then after the AKP government became a monopoly, it essentially could sideline others, and saw all of the sort of the balance of power, if you want to use the same language as I did, that was keeping it more measured and restrained in the 2000s, all of that started changing economically, politically, and socially. But growth continued. How did it continue? Well, you see, you see the growth is continuing, not as fast as before, but it's continuing without TFP. So that's, again, going back to the question that the previous participant asked. It isn't that growth, at least for medium-length periods, 10 years, sometimes 20 years, is impossible, but it is a very different type of growth. It is growth not based on technological improvements. It's not based on productivity improvements. It's growth that leads to much greater inequality. And where does it come from? Well, this is investment in Turkey. This is the construction sector. So you see, in Turkey, about every $2 out of out of $3 of investment goes to construction. It's a very much credit-driven construction sector-driven top-down growth, and that's why it's not coming with productivity improvements, with better composition of exports, and it's coming with greater inequality. But it's because that's the sustainability problem of that growth is exactly what we are living through. Yes, please. Oh, sorry. I am after.
Thank you very much, Hoca, for the very enlightening speech. My question would be, in the last 20 years, we are experiencing some very high potential disruptive changes, which kind of influencing the whole world in general. What do you think about the implications in the future? Would it be more equalizing out the norms, or would it be more put more emphasis on the surveillance part?
I think that's a great question. Thanks for asking that. And my answer was sort of implicit here, but thanks for giving me an opportunity to expand on it. I completely agree with you. I think we are in the midst of at least 3, probably 4, perhaps even more trends that are all interlinked and create a time of challenges, treacherous traps, and perhaps crisis. First, I already showed you this. I'm not sure that I would say it's the most important one, but it's one of those. It's the increase in the power of technology to survey and control people. The second is another aspect of technology, automation. The production processes in manufacturing in almost every developed nation has been already transformed, and the next step likely is the service sector, and it's also spreading and impacting developing countries. That's creating a very different production structure. It's creating job loss. It's creating lack of opportunities for low-skilled, medium-skilled workers, and it's part of the malaise that has really beset a lot of countries around the world. Globalization has also gone exactly in that direction. Lots of opportunities for big companies, lots of threats. And related to all of these, we have a rise in populism and nationalism that we had not seen, a decade ago. So all of these are threats, but the reason why I put up this picture is because just like other changes, those threats their implications will depend on what we do with them. So the same impetus can get us into the corridor, can get us out of the corridor. Look, I gave you the example of Lagos. You know, Fashola would not have been able to give the same reassurances if he didn't have a cell phone. So there, the cell phone technology is being used for something very different than snooping on people. So it's how you use that technology. You know, early on, we celebrated the internet as the most liberating or the most democratic of institutions. We didn't think that the internet would be Big Brother version 2. So it really depends on how we use it. And there is nothing in the nature of globalization that says globalization has to create just inequalities and has to lead to the, you know, decimation of the welfare state. So those are the choices. Understanding those choices is important. Using them right is important, but also where we start from. You know, it's inevitable that AI technologies will be used differently in China than in France, for example. Please.
First of all, thank you for theorizing what we all long for these years. How do we understand that there is a strong demand for democracy in the society? What facts and figures do we look for to understand this? And what happens if half of the society demands democracy and the other half does not? And finally, what if the society has a totally wrong, a totally misunderstand concept of democracy? We have the saying, very famous, kendine Müslüman, and can you evaluate all these questions for the case of Turkey as well? Thank you, Mr. Acemoğlu.
Thank you. So, of course, each one of them require a 15-minute answer minimum. And I'm not sure whether everybody would like to stay for that. But let me say a few things. First of all, on the demand for democracy. You know, if you look at the data, and, you know, every data set is imperfect, but, you know, both the common ones like Freedom House, what you see is that there is a very strong expansion of democratic rights, political rights, civil rights in the world, pretty much everywhere in the world, different waves, happens differently in different parts of the world, but up to about 2005. So there's and this is the period where everybody is politically participant. There's a lot of mobilization in many societies from Latin America to Asia. And then around 2005, it starts reversing. Perhaps 2007. It's hard to know exactly. So I don't think the demand has gone away. And you see that, you know, in places like Hong Kong or Chile, where people are really want to go onto the streets in order to demand more from the democracy or demand more democracy. But, of course, it isn't a happy time for democracy. And some of it I've already mentioned, so let me repeat it because it's important. One is that when people lose their trust in institutions, that is not an opportune, that is not a convenient time for democratic empowerment. Because democracy does depend on people delegating power to experts and politicians in the belief that they can then rein them in. But if you stop believing in that, it doesn't work. You may want a populist authoritarian leader, or you may want laws to be completely ineffective, but you will want something else, and that's what we're seeing. The second is, and that is partly because of this inequality and unfairness trends that I emphasized related to automation and globalization. But the second is this. If you live in a society where the government is keeping social credit score on you, it's very hard to have a vocal voice for democracy. But you raise another important issue, and that's the one that we talk about in the book, but we're not, you know, it's not the main focus because we had to simplify things. You know, for most of what I discussed, I talked of power of society. What about the divisions in society? Well, the cage of norms were about that. If you want to tell the story of the US, it's all about that, you know, African Americans versus the white elite. But it's much more pervasive than that. And in many societies, there are these deep divisions of what people understand from democracy is very different, and what people want from democratic politics is very different. But I want to sort of, and with respect to Turkey, I want to make one point. You know, in Turkey there is sometimes a conception of democracy, which sometimes people call majoritarian democracy, whereas you elect a leader and then you empower that leader. That isn't consistent with the narrow corridor. Why not? Because the narrow corridor is not about the methods with which you choose people. It's about what are the constraints and what are the channels of influencing that person. So if the person you elect becomes beyond influence and too powerful, that is not going to be consistent. So there are the ways that in which you try to make democracy work is important in conjunction with whether you can or cannot be housed in the corridor. Please.
Yeah. So someone online wants to know if you can explain the recent developments in the UK, a country with the oldest tradition of democracy, and now systems are hijacked by actors putting self-interest in front of everything else.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the book we spent some time talking about how countries leave the corridor, and a good chunk of that is devoted to the populist instinct that becomes out of control. The populist instinct isn't unrooted, isn't something that comes as manna from heaven. It is a reflection of a discontent about how things are. It was the sort of that populist instinct that ultimately led to the reform of the product markets and the power of the big trusts such as Standard Oil and J.P. Morgan and the railways in the U.S. being scaled back during the progressive era. But that populist instinct, especially when it becomes completely associated with this disappearing trust in institutions, creates a period of great uncertainty. Out of that uncertainty, you may get reform. Out of that great uncertainty, you may get some sort of back to business as usual. Out of that, you may get, fascists or authoritarians or crazies, all sorts of things. So in Italy, you ended up with 5-star. In the US, you ended up with Trump. In the UK, you ended up perhaps with something even more durable, but perhaps not as dangerous as Trump, Brexit. But the root causes are related. The specific grievances are somewhat different. In both cases, a very important part was that a large segment of society, in fact, a lot of the labor heartland in the UK, which would have never dreamed of voting for conservatives, was the part that was left out of that globalization, technology-based, European-centered growth. So they turned their dissatisfaction to Europe, especially to European bureaucrats or to immigrants. So that is that specific discontent, but that uncertainty is there in many countries, both developed and developing. Brazil is no different, Mexico is no different, Chile is no different. So that's why we are living through a difficult period. Please.
This is Ali Mutluköylüoğlu. I have two small questions. The first one is it possible for the masses who are or who will be losing their jobs due to automation to gain new skills and have new jobs? And the second one is it possible to have a healthy democracy practice without economical independence or economical safety of the citizens? Thank you.
Actually, those are two questions that I am actively researching. And let me start with your second one, because there I can give a categorical answer. No. You cannot have a democracy if a segment of the population becomes economically inactive, economically dependent. Why not? Well, it goes back to where I started. Democracy and liberty are about people having opportunities, having the power to make real choices, and they are powered by that. If you make one group subservient to the rest, and you say, you're going to live on our handouts, you're never going to get jobs, stay at home and play video games, that will undermine political participation, that will undermine democracy, that will undermine liberty. So that's the answer, that's my answer to your second question. Of course, this is, hopefully we won't live to know all of that, but this is mostly theoretical because some of that hasn't happened yet. In terms of automation and new skills, I don't know the answer to that. There are people who claim the answer is yes. There are some practitioners who have evidence from the US of auto workers being trained as computer programmers, but whether you can do that in mass scale or not, I don't know. But what we know from previous periods of mechanization, for example, the mechanization of agriculture in the US, the people who got into new jobs weren't often the farmers who left their jobs due to automation, but their children. So if we can ensure their children get into it, at least that's some hope, but that creates the bridge problem. How do we deal with the economic fallout and how do we deal with the political fallout? Because who voted for Brexit, who voted for Trump? Well, it was predominantly the older people who really felt the discontent. Özgür?
Daron, thank you so very much for this enlightening speech. I do have a quick question. If Donald Trump is elected by November 2020, will U.S. get out of the corridor? Yes. Yes. All right.
Well, there will be a real risk, and I'm not sure I would say move to Canada for myself.
Thank you. So you assessed briefly some of the historical genealogy for this narrow corridor, so the memory or legacy of the Roman Empire and the participatory habits of the German tribes. I wonder, closer to us, what would be the place of colonial exploitation for this genealogy of the corridor, and if you think that the balance of power in the corridor could be also created by global inequalities outside the corridor. Thank you.
For asking that question. So let me actually clarify one thing which you did not imply, but I fear my emphasis on the European case, because it's interesting, that emphasis might have created the misimpression that in the book we nowhere claim that the corridor is a European phenomenon. It has occurred in many places. It has been more durable in some parts of Europe than others, but there is nothing European special about it. So I want to first clarify that. The second question is about, well, I can take that in a narrow way or in a broader way. The narrow way would be about just the colonial expansion. But the broader way would be, is it a global dependence where being in the corridor in one part is dependent on some other parts being pushed out of the corridor or being pushed into some other corner? Now, I actually don't believe so. So I do not subscribe to world system or dependence theory type ideas that those global dependencies are a necessity, while also completely recognizing that the colonial experience was both destructive for many parts of the rest of the world and set them back in any potential for moving into the corridor. A lot of that history we don't actually recount in this book because a lot of that was in Why Nations Fail. But also that in some special cases, that colonial linkages might have helped the institutional evolution. And in particular, again, in Why Nations Fail, which we mentioned briefly in the current book, is in the case of Britain, or England at the time, where the ability of a new class of merchants to benefit from, from colonial exploitation was really critical in the political and economic balances in England and then in Britain in a way that would have made probably many of the subsequent developments impossible. So I think as a case of historical record, those interdependencies are present and the colonial impact negative was very important in many cases, but as a general theoretical proposition, I do not subscribe to that. But also, this perspective emphasizes another point which should be obvious but still bears repeating. The fact that you are in the corridor and you're constrained against people who have voice and power in no way implies that you're going to be nice to people who don't have power. That may over time evolve. Some social norms may change very slowly, but generally many corridor-bound polities have made many terrible things. King Leopold himself behaved very well at home while ravaging and cutting people's hands in the Congo. So being in the corridor doesn't mean that you're nice against people who are voiceless. And that's what really the Greeks understood. That's why it wasn't enough to have those assemblies. That's why they needed to uproot hubris in the country. Please.
With regard to this long debated question or issue of social democracy decaying, how would it affect the many nations, states going out of, countries going out of the narrow corridor? What do you think about that?
Well, if you look at the story of the corridor, as I have mentioned, as I have explained at the end, you will of course recognize, as you did, that social democracy is a very important part of it. That in some sense, if you stop, I mean, I'm over-interpreting it, but if you stop Europe where it was, at the beginning of the 20th century, it would be somewhere here. Much less capacity of the state, especially in economic affairs, but also in some social ones, and much less participation in politics, and much greater risks and limits on liberty because of economic dominances, inequalities, uncertainties. So the social democratic compact that really changed labor markets, changed regulation, changed redistribution, at the same time, creating more democratic participation was a very important part of it. So that's just the preamble to your question. It is also my opinion, and I think it's even less controversial, that the last 2 decades have not been happy times for social democracy. I think globalization necessitated changes that not all social or not many social democratic governments have been able to do. The fall of Berlin Wall removed some of the arguments that existed for restraining markets in some domains and created hubris on the sides of the people who wanted to get rid of social safety nets. And I think the overreach from some social democratic governments, for example in Sweden, sometimes backfired. So all of these things, I think social democratic erosion or decay, as you called it, is a part of life. But also, I guess my account would suggest that something like social democracy, and I'm not saying that on the ideological space, but more on the space of better participation in politics, coming together with different new and more creative responsibilities on the part of the government, I think those are necessary for the corridor to work in the decades to come.
We are running out of time.
I know I'm giving too long answers, I'm sorry.
Perhaps one final question, but this time from students.
Please.
That would be.
Please, yes.
Mikrofon getiriyoruz bir saniye.
I can repeat the question.
So thank you for the opportunity. So I have 2 questions. One is that will you helping Turkey get into the corridor through the political parties just coming out, or in another form? And second is any advices or suggestions for the young people here, or if you would go back to your 20s, what would you have done differently?
That's a hard question. Let me answer the first part of the question. If indeed my very high-level summary is correct, for Turkey to get into the corridor, what it needs is path 1, perhaps with a little bit of path 3, which is but critically power of society to increase. That's not something that you can do with just by pulling down a single lever. It's a multifaceted process. It requires more democracy, better media, better social, better civil society. It also requires the parties themselves to change. You know, it's hard if the problem is one of dominance of the top at the expense of voice from the bottom, if parties are dominated by their own strongman. So a mass political participation requires many changes, some of them easy, some of them not so easy. I think that is the reason why, you know, we can tell many more stories of countries persisting on this path, and that's why these are paths, and these moves in are the unusual events. You know, in terms of my own choices, what I'll say is, you know, I don't know. I think you don't make choices anticipating exactly where they're going to lead, but, you know, luck matters a lot. You make some lucky choices, but to me, I think the most important thing was I was passionate about what I wanted to do, both academically and beyond, and that, I think, was part of my luck, and the second part was that sort of met opportune conditions. So I advise you to be lucky.
Well, I should like to thank to all institutions involved, to participants, and of course to Daron. Thank you very much.